I want to pursue that point, actually. I don't doubt the good faith in all of your answers. And this is about politics, but it's also intensely political. Ms. Billingham, I want to pick you up on something you said earlier. You talked about various actors and agencies that we subject to scrutiny. I didn't hear much about politicians, local government, regional government, national government. Are they part of your? Are they going to be subject to that scrutiny as well?
Yes, I'll answer because you've addressed it to me, but I think Anne will and Eleanor absolutely from the local government point. The very first hearing that we are going to have as an inquiry is going to be a national hearing where Anne's already talked about the 400 recommendations of all of the inquiries related to grooming gangs that have made recommendations in the past. Our very first act will be to call local government, national politicians to the inquiry to account for what of those recommendations that have been, kind of given to them on their watch, what have they delivered, what haven't they delivered, and why. And absolutely all, the list of agencies, organisations, local government, national government, police, CPS, the health service, the list as long as your arm, we could go through them all now, we've got them here, will all be, right from the get-go of our inquiry, being asked to account to us as a statutory inquiry as to what's happened in the past and why haven't the changes that we all want to see being made. And then we'll be moving into our local inquiries where we can actually kind of test what's happening on the ground as of now, because this can't just be a backward-looking inquiry. We've got to look to the future in order to make sure this abhorrent crime that's being meted out on children still today, I'm afraid, as we sit here, that it stops for good.
So we can talk through where we are with our plans and some of that, and Zoe started talking about some of that. I mean, if you think about, if you see this as a stock take, if you like, at first, a stock take of the national organisations that we would have expected to deliver the 400, to ask them publicly, this will be in hearings, ask them, where they've got to, what needs doing, who's leading on this, what level of priority does this have in their organisation, is it being delivered, how do they know it's being delivered, what would they expect to be delivered, what will they do if it's not been delivered, proper bottoming out stuff on all of the organisations that you'd expect that, which would be all of the agencies. And then also what we'll do is we'll look at the areas where there've been inquiries or serious scrutiny, and we'll get them back to ask them exactly the same. So all of these things happen, and the way we see that going is that we will have a benchmark then at the beginning. That will all take place, towards the end of this year, but that will be the benchmark. And then when we move into our local areas, I know I'm morphing along a bit, when we move into our local areas, that is the starting point. We'll interrogate in each one, but yes, the answer is, of course, local authorities will be very much part of that. And one of the areas, of course, everyone knows that we're focusing on is Oldham, and the legal rule 9s, the letters that go out asking for evidence, have already gone to Oldham this week to start that process.
If I can give an example of a government department rather than local authorities, because the local authorities will all be under the scrutiny, but the Department of Transport have actually started some work, both in relation to bringing in national minimum standards on taxi licensing, but they're also consulting on a change to where taxis are licensed, and there hasn't been a change in that since 1847. So you have 263 licensing authorities, all of the local authorities that have responsibility. And the suggestion is to move that down to 70 regional regional transport authorities, to give that responsibility to a much wider evidence base, much wider area base. But that doesn't answer one of the fundamental questions about out-of-area working. So in respecting and recognising the Department of Transport have done a lot of work and have responded to Baroness Casey's recommendations, we want to then press further into that in relation to saying, yes, that will actually help with, it will help with enforcement, it will help with those sort of like national standards, but unless you take action specifically to disallow out-of-area working, if you're going to work in that area, you've got to be licensed in that area, then actually the problem will persist, because people who want to do harm will find the loopholes. So in that example, we'll be looking for those loopholes and pressing for additional work, additional regulations and additional changes that need to be made to strengthen what has already been put into place.
And just to be clear, local authorities, but also local politicians' failure in the political process, will that be part of your inquiry?
Yes, if you take the example where it's been suggested that for concerns over community cohesion, for example, certain actions weren't taken. We will be looking for evidence of that. We'll be looking for examples of that. Those are not the sorts of decisions that are taken in a social care context. They're taken in the context of another part of the local authority, often in political circles, not so much in sort of like informal decision making, but more in how things are passed into another part of the council, and we'll be able to evidence that, look at that, and then ask questions in our formal hearings, ask questions under our statutory powers as to why that was the case, and why were they squeamish, or why were they concerned.
And just to add that, obviously one of the themes we're going to be really looking at in some detail is around children's care. We know that such a proportion of children were care experienced that were targeted by grooming gangs. Obviously, we've all seen the serious case reviews and the inquiries and heard from victims themselves about how they were let down. So that's an example of a national theme. And then obviously when we look locally, we'll be looking at all of those issues in some detail. And the whole issue about dereliction of duty in public office will be something that we'll be keen to explore.
The terms of reference are absolutely explicit. They say the inquiry will not attempt to be exhaustive and will not investigate every local area where grooming gangs have operated. If you want to be on time and on budget and produce a high-quality report, that must be correct. What are you going to say to victims in areas that haven't been selected? Beacon Port is part of that answer. But what is you an inquiry? What avenues are you going to give them to be heard?
So we will have a victim engagement strategy, which we'll be launching when we launch our criteria in our first tranche of areas as well, and website. So that will go live then. There'll be routes for victims and survivors to be involved in many ways. Some which, if there's a local inquiry in those areas, but they could also be part of some of the national inquiries. We will have some form of story telling or sharing with victims and survivors, and some call for evidence as well with victims and survivors. So there'll be routes across our national pieces of work. We'll gather evidence and draw on those from across the piece. So what we're trying to do here is find ways where there should be no one who's left without the feeling that they have a route to be able to be part of this if they wish. And alongside that, we're having support for victims and survivors as part of that process, and obviously trauma-informed support as well. So that is the aim, that the various strands will offer different options for victim survivors in different areas. Alongside the national and the local, if there are particular things which look like they're very distinct examples of things going very wrong, miscarriage of justices, we'll be able to look at those as well. So we'll still have the flexibility to be able to do that as well. So that is kind of a mixed range, which I'm giving you in terms of our intentions at this stage. But we'll be able to say more about that when we come back to talk to you, if we do so in July.
And it's very important that we give the victims and survivors choice and control an understanding as to what happens to their information when they share it with us, and for them to be able to be in control of how we can use that information. We don't envisage victims and survivors being cross-examined within our hearings. We start from a position of this happened. Their information helps us to understand the patterns and the impacts of abuse. We don't need to investigate that abuse. That's not our role.
Oh, that's one of my next questions. Thank you.
And we will have a victim and survivors charter, which we're working with victim and survivor groups now on, and which again will launch when we come to launch our criteria and our first areas in a few weeks' time.
And that anticipates another one of my questions.
All right, sorry about that.
The pre-commencement survivors panel has now been formally disbanded. The replacement panel has not yet been announced. The charter has not yet been produced. How are victims and survivors sort of helping frame what you are aiming to do at this stage?
Well, the panel was the Home Office's panel, which they recruited to advise on establishing the inquiry. So that was in its final stages when we were appointed. So what we're seeking to do is to find ways, as I say, for victim survivors to find their best way of being part of this. And the charter that is underway in development at the moment will set how we do that. Some of it is obviously going to be about, our respectful relationships and commitments to keep people informed and the like, but it will also be how victims and survivors can be part of it. Now, there'll be a number of routes. It will come live very soon. We, as you can appreciate, we're in the set-up position where we are seeking to get a whole range of things ready to go as soon as we can. But victim survivors groups at the moment that we have been talking to have either come to us or we've made contact with established groups of survivors and victims, and there's been a number of those discussions where we've been really grateful for those groups of facilitating those discussions around the country, and we established some of those relationships during the consultation on the terms of reference, and when we had those conversations then we said we'll be back in touch next to talk about the charter and the development of the charter. So that's what we are doing at the moment.
What time frame do you think for the charter? What are we talking about?
It'll be launched when we launch our criteria and our first tranche of areas in 5 or 6 weeks.
And there will be a panel of survivors, or are you not?
We're looking at a panel at the moment because we think that actually could be quite restrictive. What we want to do is find ways to work in different ways with survivors as they please, for people to be able to find different routes in. But our relationship with survivors and survivors groups that we've already established, which is growing and significant, some of those will have regular check-ins over time. We will have webinars for survivors and victims. We will have a whole range of different things where we will be able to have contact and maintain that contact. That's what we're developing at the moment.
And that will be from individuals who've given us consent to contact them directly, into sort of like small groups of survivor-led organisations up to bigger, more established groups, so that everyone, whether an individual or part of a group, can actually sort of like feel engaged and involved and have choice and control as to how they engage with us either through the website or through correspondence.
Zoe wants to come in quickly.
I'm really quickly. I mean, I think it is very unusual for an inquiry of this nature. We have determinedly said we want to hear directly from victims and survivors right from the get-go, and that doesn't mean just emailing or kind of talking remotely. We've been to their hometowns and sat in rooms and heard very, very clearly directly from victims and survivors and relatives the experience that they've had and their expectations on us to deliver this. And part of that conversation, as Anne has said, is recognising there are so many victims and survivors who haven't come forward but may come forward as part of this inquiries. We have we will, as panel members, continue that series of face-to-face, very private engagements with victims and survivors, so they hear directly from us, not through the press, not through even, dare I say, their MPs, but they hear directly from us where we are in terms of our inquiry, what we're struggling with, what we're finding, what we're thinking, because that's really important. That's what putting victims and survivors at the heart of this inquiry means in reality.
And what do
really
they think
key.
at each stage as
Absolutely.
And it's absolutely critical they have agency.
Yeah.
Victims
Yes.
have agency.
Yeah.
What is your views on the very contentious issue in coercive relationships of those victims that will want to address the perpetrator? Will you have any dealings with restorative justice processes?
Well, it is something that has raised itself in those initial discussions in terms of reference, and there were a number of people who had been involved in similar exercises before. So it is something that we will consider, but we haven't as yet got to a view on it.